and I'm very honored to present to you part of my PhD research that I'm finishing up. So I finish up this month, and so I'm very excited to be here. Thank you everyone that registered, that's taking their time to listen to a little bit of what I'm doing. And I saw that it's very cool and very interesting that my professor that was in undergrad that actually introduced me to corpus linguistics is also here. So thank you, Chris, for being here, and honor also. She was the one that got this started, right? So I will also want to thank, well, of course, LAEL. I've been here for a number of years now, and our corpus research group, 𝗟𝗲𝗃, who has the most amazing and supportive students, and of course NAU, especially Dr. Egbert, who was my supervisor during my Fulbright year there last year, Dr. Rappin, Dr. Berber, who supported me so much while I was there, as well as Dr. Collocation, who helped tremendously with all of the programming for the research that I'm going to show you. So let's get started. To give you a short intro, how I got started into this. So as Tony mentioned, I've been teaching academic English, as well as especially professional English for professional areas for specific purposes. And collocation has been a big part of it. Collocation, a lecture on collocations was what got me started in corpus linguistics, and I've always been interested in this. And as we say, as Crossley says, collocations in academic English, it's one of the most important index of vocabulary development. So that makes it pretty important to take a look at it and see what's going on. But not only collocations, what really interests me is when you look at going beyond the collocation to look at patterns in text and how they are interconnected. And so Phillips has this notion of lexical networks, right, where collocational patterns may reveal what a text is about, right, or aboutness of text. And that got me really interested in thinking about, can we, when we think about what we say a text is about, or when we look at meaning in text, how can collocations play a role in that? And Williams took that a little bit further into collocational networks, where in his study, he kind of expanded onto Phillips' ideas and looked at how patterns in collocation, so collocational networks or networks of collocates across nodes, can also review the meaning of discourse communities. So he looked at plant biology articles, but it also kind of took the same, well, a different approach, but the same idea, right? Can collocational patterns enable awareness of what a text is talking about, right? What a text is carrying in terms of meaning for the reader, for the writer. And we know that, from their research that this exists, we can look at a node, so we can take an initial node and find what that collocational network for that node is, right? Taking it to the next level, we now can see this visually, can see this graphically illustrated. Graphical in the sense is a great software where once we input the text, we choose a node, we can see the whole network and how all these nodes and collocates are interrelated, and then how those collocational networks are being built. And that is amazing, and it's been incredibly useful in terms of teaching, in terms of looking at networks of interrelated collocates across a node for one node, but both Phillips, Williams studies, as well as even on graphical, you still kind of depend on choosing a node, right, as an initial node. So I have to have one. When you think of Williams stacks on collocational chains, you always start with a single node. So then that got me thinking, I don't want to choose a single node, right? Especially when you think about teaching applications and everything. I want to have a set of collocations, a set of collocates across a set of nodes. Is that possible, right? So that was the idea for thinking about dimensional collocational analysis. So my thinking is, nodes and collocates cannot be considered in isolation, right? It must be taken as part of a larger set of collocational networks. So then, if you consider a larger set of collocational networks, can we say the construction of meaning impacts or subject matter or aboutness can be supported not only by the lexical networks of specific nodes, of particular nodes, but also patterns of association among collocates across nodes. So I don't not only have meaning rising from one specific node and that node's network of collocates, but an interrelated set of nodes that share collocates, right? So that's the idea, and then how do I reach that, right? How so that was the reason for being inspired in the multidimensional analysis methodology to see if we could extract extended collocational networks without having to specify an initial node. So what I mean by extended is we are not only taking the collocational network for one node, but we are taking the collocational networks across a set of nodes. So that is what we're calling extended collocational networks. And so that got into some of my research questions. Not all of them are here, since this is just the good part. But when considered across node words in a corpus, is it possible to identify collocation dimensions? And by collocation dimensions, I mean extended collocational networks where a set of collocates are shared across a set of nodes, right? And if so, if that is true, do these collocation dimensions reflect aboutness of lexicon? Can I say that it arises meaning in text? And then to what extent can those be interpreted semantically? And also thinking in terms of function, right? We know that multi-word expressions also reflect underlying functions. So can we say that these collocation dimensions are also, these collocational patterns are also reflecting underlying functions in written academic texts? So to do that, I collected a corpus of the CAT, Corpus of Academic Texts. Very inspiring name. But I collected journal articles and college-level textbooks to represent written academic language and I chose 5 discipline areas according to the National Science Foundation. So the idea when I first started this was to have a huge undertaking. And so I collected all of these, but because this is a proof of concept, I didn't know this was going to work. I decided to test it out on a subcorpus. So I used the social, behavioral, and economic sciences subcorpus, which amounts to almost 8 million tokens across 230 texts, right? And then all of the tags were tagged for part of speech and lemma with the 3-tagger. So I took that subcorpus, right? And let's see what we did. So step 1, was collocation, identification, and extraction, right? What does that mean? So I had first to identify and extract the collocations from the text. So I decided to look at only complete lexical collocations as defined by Sinclair et al. So I'm looking at recurrent patterns, recurring sets of items occurring in a window span, right, within a window span. So I looked at only lemmatized adjectives, verbs, and nouns, right? And then I chose the 2,000 most frequent nodes in the corpus as my starting point. And then I looked and found the collocates for those nodes across a window span of 4 to the left and 4 to the right. And then the strength of association measure that I chose to use was log dice, since, as Tony says, as Berber Sardinha says, it's a middle ground between MI and T score. So I can still have exclusivity without having the too much or too little of collocation. So it becomes a middle ground. And my minimum log dice value of 7, and then minimum collocation frequency of 5, and dispersion, it must occur in 5% of the text at least, right? One thing that I want to point out is I started out selecting 2,000 most frequent nodes. That was my first filter, right? And then afterwards, those the filters that are here, the criteria that are here, were applied to the node and collocate pairs, right? So then I did end up with less than 2,000 nodes just because of that. So all the identification, the extraction were carried out with Python scripts that were written specifically for this study. And I identified 17,893 unique collocations, right? And so in order to carry out a dimension reduction procedure, so I divided that data set into nodes and collocates, with nodes being observations and collocates being the variables. And to do that, I ended up with 1,615 nodes and more than 2,000 collocates. And the methodology that I chose, so inspired, as I said, by the multidimensional analysis, was exploratory factor analysis. And in order to do that, I had to reduce the data set. So best practice is, a ratio of 5 observations to per variable. So my final data set was reduced to 323 collocates. So I ran exploratory factor analysis. I extracted an 11-factor solution that was the most interpretable, and so occurring with representing almost 22% of variance. If you think about factor analysis, it's not high chair variance, but it is in line with all of the lexical multidimensional analysis, all of other collocational multidimensional analysis that have been done in the literature. They're usually not very high variance encountered in these studies. So then I ended up with 11 factors extracted and 286 variables. So 286 collocates that entered into one of those factors, right? And then I interpreted the dimensions, and it worked. We had 11 dimensions, collocation dimensions of written academic English, right? And they're all here. So first one, finance and economics. Number 2, classification. 3, social and cultural development. 4, exerting influence and shaping outcomes. 5, empirical research methods. 6, local and global society. 7, reporting research. 8, individuals in society. 9, gaining knowledge and developing concepts. 10, social welfare. And 11, marking time and sectioning. So the first thing is, because we were able to get to collocation dimensions that actually made sense and represented extended collocational networks, so we can say that it does work. I can use exploratory factor analysis or dimension reduction procedures to reach collocational patterns without having to specify an initial node, right? So I can find collocational patterns that are not only exist, but they also are part of different domains, right? So I can interpret these in terms of semantics. So one thing that caught my attention when I was, and I won't go through all of them and bore you with 11 descriptions of 11 dimensions, but I do want to point out some ones that were interesting, right? First one was finance and economics. Remember, this corpus is social, behavioral, and economic sciences. And the first dimension, the one that represents the most variation in terms when we think of terms of dimension reduction procedures, it only reflects finance and economics, right? And there could be a number of reasons for that. One is methodological, because of the node selection. So I did choose I use frequency as my cutoff. So that could be that the nodes are representing more finance and economics texts. But it could also mean, just finance and economics kind of permeates all aspects of society, right? All of the other ones are more related to social and behavioral themes, and topics. But every single one of them, when we look at their texts and at the collocations that they represent, they also have a little bit of economics in them, and topics that are more how social and cultural development is affected by government and economics, or something like that. So then it is kind of present in all of them, but mostly in number one, right? So that was kind of interesting. And then if you remember, my third question was, can these patterns be interpreted in terms of function? And then we see that, if you look at dimension 2 and dimension 11, classification and marking time, they're all about function. Classification is all about categorizing nouns, species nouns. So, and then marking time is all about registers. So it's all about marking sections in the text, chapters in the textbook, marking time in terms of when events occurred in society or in economics. So that was pretty interesting finding. And then one that I will talk about, empirical research methods and reporting research, they are totally complementary. So one is about describing research, the other is about completely reporting the research that was carried out. So that was pretty interesting. So let me get to the actual results. And so we got 10,474 unique collocations occurring across these 11 dimensions. And let's take a look. So finance and economics, major topics that we were able to identify were job market. So text or topics about wage, income, workers, hiring, firing workers, investments. So anything related to finance and investments in that way. So in either classifying or describing types of investments and what happens in an investment world, but also describing projects and studies related to investments. Market economy and business. So in general, right, thinking about day-to-day business, price, production, demand, supply, anything related to money. So these are, in this dimension, we had 42 collocates, right? And across, they formed almost 1,800 unique collocations across 527 nodes, right? So this was pretty interesting, the number of unique collocations that we were able to reach, and then across that number of nodes. So if you take a look at, when we go back to the text and see what this looks like in the text, so we have, a firm may pay, and then we have pay a wage, right, reduce labor, wages, reduce or high wages. Then a firm pays its workers, right, paying a wage, or firm reducing something, and then hiring workers. So all of those texts are descriptive of the way that the job market works. Same thing for investments. So when you look at capital gains and losses, capital assets, earn a profit, capital loss, hold an asset, right? So all of those are collocations that came up for investments. And then one thing that was really interesting, when you think about in terms of function, a lot of the collocations that were occurring were all quantification of something. So we have all of these attributed adjectives working in terms of quantifying something. So average number, higher rates, lower employment, higher earnings, higher demand. So all of those that occur in a very high frequency in this. So let's take a look at those two that were complementary. These I thought that were pretty interesting, especially if you're thinking about when we write journal articles, when we're teaching writing, and I thought that was pretty interesting. It had some really ready applications, I guess. So empirical research methods, that's it. It's empirical research methods and statistical procedures. So if you look at the collocates, they're all related to statistics or any type of method of research, right? So we had 27 collocates, and then comprising almost 1,000 unique collocations across 415 nodes. So when you look at the text, right? So for example, the first one, we first estimate a linear regression with year fixed effects, dt as follows. So it's basically describing what they're doing in their experiment, right? With more independent variables in the model, a larger sample size is usually needed. And then we have, so perform comparative analysis on such data obtained in separate experiments. So these are all about verbs and, used to, verbs and then the nouns that are used to describe, statistical procedures, and then action verbs on what exactly is being done, right, in these studies. And then when we look, so these are, as you can see, a lot of the collocates are nouns, and then the nodes themselves are mostly verbs, right? And then when we look at 7, which is completely complementary, we have the opposite. We have, pretty much all of the verbs and adjectives, and as collocates, and then as nodes, all of those nouns, right, that were in dimension 5. So the major topics here are the patterns that are part of the empirical research methods domain as well, but they are used to report or describe research findings and literature review, right? So they are shared across the same domains, but the emphasis here is the act of reporting rather than conducting research. So when you look at this, we say, so empirical findings indicate, right, that an effective perceptual bias, etc., right? So recent literature suggests, right, the 3 models could explain behavioral showing. So fairly consistent evidence indicates. So all of this is whatever the research I was conducting that was, being used to the collocations were used to describe the carrying out of the research in dimension 5. Here, the collocations are being used to describe, to report whatever that research was carried out. What were the results of those studies? So I thought that was pretty interesting. And so that was, as I said, I won't mention all of them, but that's pretty much, what I wanted, I guess what I wanted to find, because, I wanted to be able to see how these are working together and without having to choose a specific node first, right? So that was, and that was something that we were able to do. So that I was pretty happy. Of course, there were some limitations. So lack of dispersion measure for nodes is one. It could be that all of this is, is just because of my node selection, but hopefully not. And also the variables, this is something interesting because, for factor analysis, it's very highly unusual to have variables and observations to be the same. And in this case, they are linguistically the same. They are nouns, verbs, and adjectives. As you've seen, especially dimensions 5 and 7 that I've shown, they are the same verbs that were nodes in dimension 5 were collocates in dimension 7, right? And vice versa. So the nouns that were collocates were nodes in dimension 7. So that is something that to think about. It could be that could be the reason that that's driving the results, and that it happens that in some cases a small set of nodes with the highest factor scores are driving the interpretation of the dimension, right? So that that is something to think about as well. And this happens with a lot of the lexical research that use factor analysis and dimension reduction procedures, but with the exception of one collocate in dimension 9, there were no collocates with negative loadings. This is something to explore a little bit more, but it is something that happens fairly frequently in dimension reduction results with Lexis. So that's it. And then what can we do with this, right? So how can we apply this? So one thing is informed development of pedagogical materials. So if you think about, we have, use academic collocation lists. They're incredibly useful, but they are not discipline specific, or they are not, we cannot group them together according to a semantic domain, for example. So that could be done with the dimensions and the collocations that occurred in each of the dimensions. So to inform, all of the pedagogical materials and teaching practices in EAP and ESP classrooms. So thinking about along the lines of what Anna presented last week, for exercises with lexical bundles. So those can, so collocations can also be applied in those types of exercises. And also, this is something that we used, and this is thanks to Dr. Joe Collentine from NAU as well. A lot of the stuff that we extracted, we can build into libraries and lexicon as part of an LTK package or any other package that can be used in Python. So that's something that we are looking into doing, and that can be done. So that can support other types of research with that use collocations as input. So, and then any future directions, I did use try to use a larger dispersion of nodes. across numbers of texts, maybe look at registers and disciplines and subdisciplines to reach more general collocational patterns, to see that, you know, if we can apply these to a larger shared discipline, for example. And then conduct, I only did this for one of the areas, as I said, because this was a proof of concept, you know, to see if it would work. So conduct this for the other four National Science Foundation research areas individually and for the full corpus. So that's something that we are starting to do. And these are my references, and that's coming to the end. Questions, and thank you for listening. This is my contact information if you want to reach out later.
All right. This is great, Carol. Thank you so much. Now we have lots of time for questions and answers, and we have questions already in the Q&A. But before you get to those, could I ask you if you could explain in very simple terms what a dimension is and what a dimension of collocation does that normal collocations don't? So for instance, if I notice a collocation in a text or in a corpus, as I'm looking at a concordance line, what's the difference between doing that and doing what you've done?
Okay, so basically, well, a dimension shows patterns of co-occurrence, right? So between the variables and the observations that you have. So for example, in my case, there were nodes and collocates. In a traditional multidimensional analysis, for example, or in a traditional factor analysis, it would show, you know, how variables are co-occurring, so are occurring together. A set of, let's say you have a set of variables that occur all the time together, and then as opposed to, you know, not occurring with a different set of variables that are part of a different dimension. So basically, when you look at a dimension, what you're seeing is how are those variables, be it, if you think about, it could be a part of speech, or in this case, it's collocates, how they are working, you know, occurring together across, in this case, nodes, right, or in a text. What it's telling you, not only that, but also any underlying variation that's happening, right? So anything that's, you know, why are they occurring together? So usually it's explained by any underlying factors. So if it could be a discipline, or it could be a situational characteristic, it could be a communicative purpose. So that's why they are co-occurring together. When you think about a dimensional collocation, as opposed to, you know, what is it telling me that I cannot get from a concordance line? What it's telling me, so when I look at a concordance line, I can only look at so many, right? I'm looking at one line that shows me one collocation, right? And then I can look at a set of concordance lines that might show other collocations, and that might give me a pattern, but it does not tell me if they are all occurring together in the same text, or they are all occurring to fulfill a specific function or not, right? I'm just looking at the list of collocations that are occurring in different lines of my text, but it doesn't tell me for what reason are they occurring together in that text, right? A collocation dimension may enable us to find that reason, right? To find, okay, what is happening, not only when you look at that single line of collocation that's happening in text, but when you look at the whole thing, that are co-occurring together, is there a reason for it? Is there underlying communicative purpose for this, or is there an underlying situational, context that might happen? In this case, when you look at when I was looking at the collocation dimensions that came up, so some of those underlying reasons were functioning as classification, right? So, for example, number 2, dimension 2. So I have different nouns or different categories of things that need to be classified. So I can see the set of collocations that are all being used for that. So that the text, when I have a description of something or a process or a procedure being carried out, these are the most frequent collocations that I can use. So I could get that individually from a concordance line, but it wouldn't tell me how this is being used to actually build the text, right? And give it meaning. So I don't know if that answered the question appropriately, but I think that was, at least for me, if it makes sense. I think Larissa gave 2 weeks ago a great definition of dimensions using soup as a metaphor. So I love food, but I love to eat food. It makes it hard to describe it, but I think that was my attempt at making it similar, right?
Yes, thank you.
All right, so let's take a look at some questions. Are the Python scripts available? Yes, so they are part of my dissertation. I will be done, hopefully, if I defend and get approved this month. So as soon as that happens, then yes, they will be available. And then we're also publishing for all of the process that we took and the decisions that we made for building this as part of the making it available for this. So definitely. So another question, which could be the potential pedagogical application of a collocation dimensions awareness? So I think we did talk a little bit about this. I think it can be used to inform pedagogical materials in terms of when you think about either a subject matter or a text that's going to be written. So let's say in terms of register, a journal article, we do have some dimensions that are particularly, that reflect particular aspects of writing. So I think when you think about not only in terms of writing the actual writing in terms of function, but in terms of topic, so building that topic or building that aboutness of what the text is about, I think that could be very useful. Okay. Let's see. Sonia has a question. Do you think that your preliminary results on collocations could be extrapolated to linguistic patterns of other languages besides English? I think that would be very interesting to see. And I'll extrapolate and say that it could, because if you think about all of the multidimensional analysis studies that have been done in different languages, they all have at least 1 or 2 dimensions that are universal, right? So we have, for example, we have narrative, we have that's universal, conversation versus information. So I think, that it could. I think there are some things. So for example, when you report things or when you talk about exerting influence, that's one of the dimensions. I think these are all concepts that we have no matter what the language is. So I think that it could be extrapolated into other languages, but it would be very interesting to do that, Sonia. That'll be very interesting to see. So let's see. So in my dimension, reporting research, you observed collocates, which include hedging devices. I didn't consider hedges when I was studying the collocations. That wasn't something specifically that I considered, but it is. But they are there. Some of them are there. Yes. So Joe, is it common? It's common to look at factors that have a lot of loadings that high and low beyond the cutoff. But factors can also reside in an associative or dissociative relationship. Yes. So dimensions that are correlated tend to reside in a subdimensional relationship. So have I examined and explored the implications for the correlations between the factors? Not yet. I do want to look at that to see associative or dissociative correlations between specifically those two dimensions that seem to be correlated, but that wasn't part of what I've done yet. No. So let's see. Okay, so in your presentation, you have mentioned collocates that are observed in more than one dimension. Is there a view of collocates from the overall perspective? Are there meaningful patterns? So, Rogério, the collocates, they occurred only in the specific dimensions, but the nodes, yes, the nodes occurred across the dimensions, and from the overall perspective, yes, there are. I did look at the whole thing. There are some meaningful patterns, and when you look at the collocations that are shared across, and when I mean shared across, so then the nodes are being shared across the dimensions. So, and there are some, not a lot, but there are some meaningful patterns that can be seen when you look at the overall perspective. The most of them are not discipline specific. They tend to be, and I think that's normal from all of the studies that we've seen. They tend to be more related to function than lattice. Marisa is asking, so how we come up with the naming of the 11 dimensions? That's the hardest part in any dimensional study, is coming up with a lot with the naming. In this case, a lot of support and help from the corpus research group, discussing with everyone the results, and then actually looking at, for me, it's looking at the text. I did use WordNet to support me with classifying the groups of nodes, and I did do, it's not here, I didn't present it, but I did do cluster analysis for node typology, so then that helped a lot. And I use, and WordNet, the classifications for those were very useful as well, to come up and with kind of like a shared topic and a shared subject matter that was coming up on the dimensions. So, but that was the hardest part. Absolutely. I would say the statistics, it's okay, it's done, but naming the dimensions, it's usually the hardest part, definitely. Okay, so Maria Fred is asking, what's the difference between textbooks and journal articles in terms of collocational networks? So that wasn't part of what I looked at and initially, so I do have them specified as in terms of what is coming from a textbook, what's coming from a journal article, but because this was not a traditional multidimensional analysis, I did not look at registered differences. That is something that I did do for a pilot study that has been published, actually. It came out this year, and there are differences. We see that, for example, Dimension 1, Finance and Economics, is being heavily driven by textbooks. most of the nodes and and collocations that are occurring have a higher frequency in textbooks than journal articles. And then you see some of the dimensions that have the opposite, that have specifically the ones that are 5 and 7, the ones that are reporting research and conducting research, are much more representative of journal articles. But that wasn't part of the variables that I looked at. I did look at it afterwards, and it is, some of the differences are there. But not, I can't tell you that if it is significant or not, because that wasn't something that was I was looking at. So let's see. Oh, hold on. So what tool did I use to analyze the text? Okay, so what I did, I extracted when I extracted the collocations and everything, and then I had a script that ran through the text and grabbed me the text parts that had those collocations that were part of the dimension. So I did use Python. I also used ntconf to look at, to make it easier to find the examples for the presentation. And then also to kind of look at them individually. So I did, but I used both. I used Python script and as well as ntconf. All right. So have you ever thought about creating a site similar to Lingui? Oh, that would be very cool. I would love that. Well, I'm teacher, so I want to share this as, and I think it would be very useful. So, if I would take any suggestion on how to what would be the best way to share so that teachers can get, and even any person can take a look and find these results. So it would be very cool. Okay, can you explain once more how you operationalized across nodes, parting the research questions? So across nodes, Maria, is so when you think about the factor analysis, when you're looking at what I was looking at is how those collocates were forming collocations with different sets of nodes. So that's what I mean across nodes. So it's not only with, I'm not only looking at the set of collocates for each individual node at a time, but I'm looking at the set of collocates for all of them at once. So that's what I mean by across nodes. Irina, I have not used yet. Actually, I did use some of my results to develop teaching materials, but for private classes, this is something that would be very cool to make it available to everyone. Yes. Could collocations be analyzed in terms of text quality for a teaching purpose? How? That would be very interesting. I don't know if you can say that a text has higher quality or lower quality because of the collocations that are used, but I think we can say, what collocations that are, most common or most frequently used in certain texts, right? It would depend on the register, so it would be kind of like saying, is it appropriate to use or not? I don't know if you can say, the quality of this text is good or bad because of that collocation. But I think we can say, we can analyze in terms of appropriateness. Is it appropriate to use that specific collocation or not? Glenn is asking, hold on. For the difference, if there were any confusion in coding between adjectives and pragmatics. Not really. So I did use tree tagger. I did check the tags, and I did some manual checking not for all of them. there were some things, especially with the newer, so texts that were more recent, there were some confusion in the tagging that I had to fix manually, but mostly no. Okay. Text to search for the collocations, most of them were in science or math field. Okay, so Fernanda, all of these, so the topics were more science and math fields, but the field that I used, so all of the texts, they were equally numbered. Okay, so they were from social, behavioral, and economic sciences, even though it appears that most of them were science or math, but no, they were actually, there were a lot of social sciences. There are actually, well, the same number of, in terms of the disciplines. Social sciences, behavioral sciences, and economics. So all three of them. Oh, so question is, hold on. So if I looked at, by looking at lemmas, you have introduced an effect for grammar, created a level of abstraction. Have you thought about what the effects would be if you looked at lexemes themselves with the same methodology? Would the perspective be different, complementary? I did think about, and there are a number of studies that say we should look at lexemes rather than lemma. And I think it could, I don't think they would be different. It would be I think we could apply the same methodology. I think the results will probably be complementary. I don't think they would be very different from what I found with lemmas. It might be, when we get down to very specific levels, there might be some difference, but I don't think it would be, overall, I don't think there would be that many differences. Okay. Oh, okay, so awesome, thank you. So Christina is saying, thinking about the curriculum of our universities in Brazil that don't usually include in writing classes anything that looks at collocations in morpho, syntax, or semantic classes. So it would be very great to have that. I agree. I think it would be awesome to include that and include more. I think, 𝗏𝗚𝗃 and LAEL is very different in a way that we have, included corpus linguistics in a lot of the undergrad curriculum, but most of our universities in Brazil don't do that. So it would be awesome to have that. We're starting to, right? We're starting to have it, but it would be cool. So I think, Olfa, I answered a little bit with regards to article and textbooks. There are some very similar distributions. I did not choose to look at specifically articles and textbooks, but they are looking at the results and the dimensions and how they were found. It does seem to be very, very little differences, but I think that's something that I'll definitely think about looking into. So let's see. It would be very useful to see categorization of collocation dimensions together with the underlying functions. Oh yes. So that would be something. It would be so with communicative purposes and situational context. It would be a really outstanding tool for text analysis of writing. I agree, and that would be amazing to have. A tool for that we can. Use these results and together with results from MD with communicative purpose and situational context register analysis. So it would be definitely really cool.